Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. And I'm going to start. We talked a little bit about this question when I first met you, but what was your inspiration for your wonderful award-winning play, In the Cervix of Others?
In the Cervix of Others has a long history and evolutionary process. So there's several different inspirations. It has its roots in a solo play I wrote in 1991 that was somewhat autobiographically based. At the time, I was involved in a class action lawsuit against Big Pharma, and we had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And so all of the women who were involved in this pharmaceutical corruption case were not allowed to tell our story. And so I thought, oh, well, I'm a playwright. I can tell my story in a play through a fictional character. And so I wrote a 15-minute solo play called Jessica on the Ceiling. And it was a kind of a surreal recounting of an experience I had when my cervix was videotaped for a medical training film during which I watched myself from the ceiling, as one does. So
One does.
Yes,
it's a universal experience.
It is absolutely. I don't know any woman who's had that experience who has not watched herself from the ceiling. So I first performed the play for doctors at a conference because I wanted them to hear this story. And that 1991 was not coincidentally the year of the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearing. And so I began to think that I wanted to enlarge the story, and I began to expand it into a story about the many ways that women are silenced. I never finished it. And maybe it wasn't the right time to tell the story, so I put it on a shelf. And this was a literal shelf because my floppy disk from 1991 was obsolete, so I only had the hard copy. So cut to 2018. I watched the devastating Brett Kavanaugh, Christine Blasey Ford hearing. And the next day, I thought, I need to go back to this story because some things have changed so much, and then it's kind of a cyclical thing. So little has changed, and the parallel between the Anita Hill experience and the Christine Blasey Ford experience and Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh both being confirmed was so frightening to me, and it was a moment that needed to be addressed in a very forceful way. And I thought I need to go back to Jessica's story and enlarge it to encompass this kind of generational shift and this generational lack of change. Mm-hmm. And so I took the dusty, literal dust script off the literal shelf and began to rethink and reconceive and re-envision Jessica's story as a kind of, this happens throughout history and throughout prehistory. So the play includes a mythological character of Philomela, and it includes these very real voices of Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford. And it also is at its center a story about older Jessica and younger Jessica, about the same woman at two different times in her life. Jessica in 1991 is at her gynecology office on the aforementioned ceiling, and Jessica is 27 in 1991, and in 2018, Jessica is 54, and in both cases, these hearings are playing on the television set in the waiting room. So those were the inspirations then and now, and many more kind of autobiographical references that have occurred both in those early days and in recent years.
It's an extraordinary play.
Thank you.
We're so excited to have the reading on Saturday.
Oh, and I'm so excited and so honored and can't wait. And I'm so delighted that you're directing it.
My next question for you is, how does this play, or does this play, intersect with your other work? And feel free to crow about some of your other work, too.
Well, a lot of the central interpersonal story in this play, in The Cervix of Others, is about Jessica and her mother. Jessica and her late mother, both of them were affected by this this pharmaceutical fiasco.
Mm-hmm.
And Jessica is kind of coming to terms, both later in life and earlier in her life, trying to come to terms with her relationship with Mom, which was troubled, which was affected by the history that has just come out, because it's just been made public that the pregnancy drug that Jessica's mother took when she was pregnant with Jessica caused Jessica's infertility and caused her mother's death from breast cancer. I think I just have to add here that the play is a dark comedy, lest someone might think that it is not. So this is going to be a digression right now, but I do feel that when, as a playwright, as a writer, that when tackling the most painful issues, it's imperative to do it with humor. And I think it makes it possible for an audience to hear it, to receive it, to engage with the material without putting up a defensive wall. So I think it's a kind of a responsibility to the audience to include humor, and it's also my personal survival mechanism to try to see the most difficult circumstances through the lens of the kind of surrealistic, is this really happening, bizarre humor inherent in it. So, that being said, so there's this story that does have a lot of pain in it. Jessica's mother has died from the same drug that affected her life. I addressed that relationship, because so much of it is autobiographical, in my second memoir, which is called The Year My Mother Came Back. And I would call it a magic realist memoir. It's about a year in my life as a mother, a year when my older daughter and my younger daughter were both going through different kinds of critical moments in their lives, and I had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. And it was a very overwhelming time in my life personally. And so for the first time in about 30 years, because my mother had died 30 years before that, and I had kind of squelched my memories about her. I had buried my feelings about her because it was a long time before, because it was too painful to keep thinking about. And so I had really kind of pushed those memories deep into the recesses of my subconscious. And then with these three equally difficult challenges happening at the same time, my memories of my mother came flooding back to me. And I acknowledge that that my mother's presence in the book is fantasy. I didn't feel that it was any kind of literal haunting, but she's a very strong presence in the book. There are dialogues. I needed to kind of rekindle that relationship with my lost mother, to figure out a path in this difficult time as a mother myself. Mm-hmm. And so the memoir, which was published by Algonquin in 2015, navigates that and looks at some of the same story that I include in the play, in The Cervix of Others. in fact, there's a memoir within the memoir, a teeny little chapter about my life through estrogen, or, the history of my life in hormones. And it tracks the way real and synthetic estrogen has impacted my life. And again, it's done with very dark humor. So that story is certainly related. And perhaps ironically, my play, What I Thought I Knew, which is adapted from my first memoir with the same title, In the Cervix of Others is a lot about Jessica's infertility. What I Thought I Knew is the story of my wildly unexpected pregnancy at the age of 44, 14 years after being told there's no possible way I could ever get pregnant. My pregnancy was diagnosed after 6 months of going from doctor to doctor for mysterious symptoms. I was sent to an emergency CAT scan for a large abdominal tumor, which was not a tumor. I was 6 months pregnant. Complications ensued, funny and not so funny. Yes, my daughter, who was with whom I was pregnant, is now a junior at Princeton. So things worked out okay, but it was a crisis. And the play addresses a whole different set of themes. I mean, it starts with how women's identities we're kind of forced to imagine and define ourselves in terms of childbirth and reproduction. And so when I was told, you are not just infertile, you were like extreme, beyond the beyond infertile, that was who I was. That was my identity, an infertile woman. And then suddenly at age 44, my identity changed, and it was not an easy transition. It was difficult to reconcile who I was with this new identity. The play also, because it was such a crisis, the pregnancy was such a crisis, it wasn't something I wanted or expected. I wanted an abortion and found out that at 6 months it was too late for an abortion, except if the mother's life is in danger. And it's turned out to be the case, and I very strongly considered a late-term abortion with Dr. George Tiller in Wichita, Kansas. Dr. George Tiller, years later, as we know, was murdered by an anti-abortion terrorist. But at the time, he was kind of a beacon of light for me. I had an appointment with him. I ended up choosing not to go to it, but knowing that I had a choice gave me hope. And I have written a lot about Dr. Tiller, and people ask me if, oh, your daughter is so wonderful, and doesn't this change your attitude about abortion? And I would say absolutely not, because it's all about choice. Because knowing that I had a choice, being able to choose to have a baby, was what made a world of difference, and the thing that gave me hope and allowed us to have the beautiful mother-daughter relationship we have now. I'm so honored that my play, adapted from that memoir, was an honorable mention with the Jane Chambers Award a couple of years ago. That was a huge honor for me, so you can imagine when I got your email. I was, maybe I'm honorable mention again. Yeah. Anyway, this was beyond.
You're a repeat offender for the Jane Chambers.
I'm a repeat offender.
So how do you see your play, In the Cervix of Others, interacting, or do you see your play interacting with feminist themes, concerns in the theater world today? You've sort of already touched on this, but I don't know if you want to make any further connections.
One of the other inspirations, in answer to this question, for taking that old piece of writing off the shelf and beginning to write In the Cervix of Others, I saw the play What the Constitution Means to Me by Heidi Schreck.
Mm-hmm.
It was, as it turned out, a week before the Brett Kavanaugh, Christine Blasey Ford hearing. So I saw it at New York Theatre Workshop, was blown away by it, thought this is the most brilliant, deeply moving work of feminist theater I've ever seen, and how timely that she is not only educating the wider audience about the history of the Constitution and about its explicit exclusion of everybody except white men. And also it was deeply personal, and it was about herself and her mother and all of her maternal ancestors, and how the constitutional inequities affected her pioneer and mail order bride ancestors. And it was profoundly moving and life-changing. Then the Brett Kavanaugh hearing happened, and I bought another ticket to see it the next night as a kind of restorative, because I felt everybody I knew was so devastated by this, and the feminist and the misogynist ramifications of that experience were very frightening. So I went to see it again, and I was so inspired by her commitment to integrating her politics and her storytelling, that it was one other kind of stepping stone for me to say I need to do something, and just to dive into working on In the Cervix of Others. So I think there are, so many feminist themes in the play. I guess the umbrella big theme is women needing to find their voice, women's voices being silenced. I think the Me Too moment, it's not a moment, excuse me, Me Too, continual change, this tremendous sea change in women's history, in American history, in world history. It has been such an important transitional moment in women's stories being heard, women's voices being heard, sometimes for the first time, stories that were not listened to, that were intentionally kept silent, or that were simply ignored for many decades, are being heard for the first time. And yet, you look at something like the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, you realize that nope, it's not the panacea. It hasn't completely changed. So I think that the importance of women's voices being heard is something that many plays, I think about, Lynn Nottage's career is kind of dedicated to voices that aren't usually heard, mostly women, but not only women, but voices, giving voice to individuals, to groups of people whose voices are not usually heard. And I think that is a really critical feminist theme, and it's certainly something that I hope my play contributes to.
As a feminist playwright, if you could change one thing about the field, what would it be?
I would like to see more plays by older women playwrights produced. 2 nights ago, I was at the home of playwright Susan Miller and about 35 other playwrights, some of whom flew in from the West Coast to be at this gathering. There's a new group that's been organized of women playwrights over the age of 40 who want to address the specific inequity. I mean, we've known for a very long time that women playwrights are not equally, there is no parity in theater, that there are many more plays by men produced than plays by women. And as well as other voices that haven't been heard. And so there has been a wonderful movement in recent years to be more inclusive, to include voices of playwrights who are more diverse. And yet, even as more women playwrights are being represented, they tend to be younger playwrights. They tend to be the new discoveries of theaters that want to kind of showcase brand new talent. And the focus of this group, which it has a working title of honor roll. We're working on a new title and mission statement now. And there are currently 200 members in our Facebook group. It's been a kind of a growing support group for women playwrights over the age of 40. But we met to address the historical inequity of the underrepresentation of women playwrights and women directors and women producers. And the specific kind of blind spot about older women playwrights. And this is a generation of playwrights that in the 80s and 90s were writing plays that were disregarded, ignored, because no one was doing women playwrights at the time, plays by women at the time. And now, as the theater world is changing and plays by women are being produced more often, older women's plays are being ignored again, so they're kind of left out on both sides. So, some of us fretted alone about this phenomenon, but now that there are more than 200 women who've kind of gathered together to try to enact some change, it's kind of an exciting moment, and I hope that the word gets out, and we are planning some public actions to spread the word and try to raise consciousness about this.
Whose work excites you?
One of the first playwrights who inspired me deeply and has continually been an inspiration to me is Anna Deavere Smith. I worked with Anna in the 1980s. We taught together. We were teaching teachers at Lincoln Center Institute, and she was working out her ideas, and I was working out my ideas, and I loved the way she was engaging public school teachers in a deep investigation of walking in each other's footsteps, listening to each other deeply, learning about another person by speaking their words. I loved her technique, and it was about that time that she premiered Fires in the Mirror. And everything she has done has been enormously inspirational. I've written a lot of solo plays that are directly inspired by her work. So she is an important kind of signpost for me. I love Heidi Schreck's play, What the Constitution Means to Me. The timing is perfect. It is a play that is politically impactful and emotionally so raw and honest, and I imagine that anybody who has the opportunity to see her play will be transformed. Certainly I was. It was one of the things that motivated me to dive into writing in the service of others. Lynn Nottage has dedicated her playwriting career to giving voice to people whose voices are usually not heard. And she's got a tremendous body of work. I love teaching her work in my playwriting courses. And my playwriting students are enormously inspirational and exciting to me. I'm kind of amazed that I have these young students and old students. I teach at the New School, and there's a tremendous variety of age and nationality amongst my students. And I give them a prompt, and I say, here's your prompt, write a play, and they do. That's crazy. But they do it, and they seem to they are so courageous and uninhibited, and they draw, I teach a course called Playwriting from Personal Experience, and my students draw on their very widely diverse personal experiences to write their play. So, for example, this past semester I had a student who'd never studied playwriting before. She ended up sharing with the class, she said that I've never shared this with a group before, but I'm going to tell you that my mother is an undocumented immigrant. It has shaped our lives, and I need to write a play about it. So all of the pieces that she'd written, kind of fragments that she'd begun that came out of a kind of unconscious, subconsciously driven improvisational writing, coalesced into a first draft of a very scary and potent play. And I will be thrilled to be her independent study advisor in the fall to help her continue to work on the play. I have friends who are playwrights who marry their playwriting with activism, like Joan Lipkin, a dear friend who inspires me all the time. I love the way she dedicates her work to creating events, public events that create social change, to working around the world, to helping people, to writing and producing plays that engage audiences and artists who are often excluded. Too many wonderful artists to mention, but I do feel that my work is very deeply inspired by my peers, my students, so many different people.